This podcast is brought to you by Big Motoring World, one of the UK's biggest used car supermarkets. Welcome to Legends of News, the podcast that talks to the journalists who've had a front row seat at the making of history over the last half a century and indeed more. We'll be hearing from the people who were on the spot when the most extraordinary and significant events unfolded right in front of them, who interviewed the good, the great and indeed the not so great, and who spent thousands of hours keeping us informed on our televisions and radios, many of them are colleagues and rivals, sometimes both, during my own 40 years. In broadcast news, my guest today, along with two other members of his family, his father and brother, represent, I suppose, the very epicentre, the quintessence of what this podcast series is all about. It would be quick to list who he has not interviewed over a broadcast career of 56 years and counting. Viewers and listeners, we have with us today none other than Jonathan Dimbleby. You're very welcome, Jonathan.
It's nice to be with you, Dermot.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I mean, you soldier on, you keep working, because the thought of not working is too terrifying.
But that's what I said, 56 years and counting. So what are you up to specifically at the moment? Still writing, I know.
Yeah, I write history about the Second World War, and it takes up a lot of time and a lot of work and a lot of kind of exhausting brain power. And then the books come out and you hope they're read and you hope they're enjoyed and you hope they're well reviewed. And I'm working on one at the moment, my next one. And I'm getting completely bogged down at the moment, to be honest, because there's so much research to do and I'm dealing with too much at once. And I'm trying to kind of coordinate my information in a way that I can then draw from it in order to write a book that is both sort of has scholastic potentials in the sense that no one's going to rubbish it if they know more than I do, and a lot of people will, but also that people will actually want to read.
But long may it last. And I know that something you wrote a very long time ago has been reissued and you've had to spend some time writing forward for that. But I mean, it is just so apposite for the times we live in now. And it really does prove the old adage, plus ça change.
Well, the book is actually, the book I wrote in 1979, came out in 1979, was about Palestine. And it was at a time when the former Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, had said, effectively, or she said in words, there is no such thing as a Palestinian people. They did not exist. And I was so outraged by that, having seen a great many Palestinian people in the Middle East, and also, as it happens, at university, that I thought I'd write about it. And probably one of the, I think the greatest photographer of his generation, of our age, Don McCullen, who shared my thought about this, took photographs. And the book was saying, here they are, Palestinians, because there wasn't much written about them in those days. And so I've written an introduction to it, a new introduction, which is quite long. Started off was going to be brief, but in order to kind of fill the years between 1979 and, because I've written the backstory before that, between 1979 and today, an awful lot happened. And it's got worse and worse and worse all the time. Glimmers of hope now and then, but otherwise, a terrible, terrible situation, which if we follow it as I do in detail, it's quite difficult to avoid it, is absolutely unspeakable. And it needs to come to an end. And that will only happen peacefully if there is a Palestinian state, a two-state solution, as it's called. If that doesn't happen, you can be sure whatever short-term pause there is, the anger, the misery, the suffering of young people. You know, the young people I met in 1979, if they're not dead, they're old. And their children and their grandchildren will say, until we have our rights, I'm afraid we will go on fighting for them. And that's the way of the world, and it is certainly the way towards, at the moment, the only way of avoiding more bloodshed, more horror, is a fair, just solution, which means abiding by the principles of the UN and providing, therefore, a two-state solution. But it seems to be going over the horizon into the distance at the moment, which is tragic.
Sounds like it's required reading. I'll be very interested to have a look at that. Jonathan, address for me the big issue, as I say, more or less the theme of this entire podcast series, to have one of the Dimblebys on Legends of News. I mean, I don't think any family more qualifies, but the thought.
Dermot.
I mean, seriously, no, absolutely.
I've never. My very first job. I live in Bristol now. My very first job was with the BBC in Bristol, and I think because of my name, people said, "Oh, can he do it?" The early evidence was that I certainly couldn't. And the greatest humiliation was I was asked to read the local news, and when I read it, the controller in Bristol got on the line to the producer and said, "Under no circumstances must Jonathan Dimbleby be allowed to read the news ever again." And you know what? I was never allowed again.
That quashes the nepotism question. It was a hindrance, but it's just the span. So from your father, you and your brother. I mean, you really do encompass the entirety of broadcast news, the invention, the dominance of broadcast news and current affairs for 80 and more years. But I want to ask you this. I mean, is there a sense now, and nothing happens suddenly in this business, but is that it? I mean, it really couldn't happen again, just perhaps for the reason in terms of how rapidly the medium and the methods of transmission are changing.
I have a nephew, my brother David's son, who is a reporter on ITN, and he is clearly going to excel and put the rest of us, his grandfather, his father, his uncle, into the shade. So, you never know what happens. But if you're talking about dynasties of some kind, I'm always uncomfortable with the notion of a dynasty, because it suggests that there's a sort of droit, a right, in the same way as like an institution like the monarchy, which it isn't. You get there, or you might, if you're foolish enough to want to get there, you work hard at it, and you do. If you're lucky, an awful lot of luck involved, and if you work very hard, and if you always think a door half closed, it's actually half open, and you're really curious, then you can maybe get somewhere.
But I mean, I get that, but I'm also talking about, perhaps more in a way, about the programmes that you certainly, and maybe a little bit I did on occasions, the appointment to view programmes, the programmes that got millions of eyeballs and eardrums, that changed policy, that changed people's views. Well, they just don't get the cut through now, because there are so many kind of channels of communication, and people so-called curate their own feeds.
That's so true. And that is for better, for worse. Sometimes it may be for better, because you can get information in ways that perhaps conventionally and traditionally you wouldn't have had. But it's true. I mean, the program I worked on, once I'd kind of left Bristol and was working on television in London, was This Week. It was one of two big weekly ITV programs. The other one was called World in Action. And they were dates, just like Panorama, which my father first presented and my brother then was principal presenter of, were required dates. And that's partly because there wasn't so much on. That was part of it. But we used to get, for This Week, on Thursday evenings, we used to get regularly 6 million plus viewers. And on a big occasion, we would get many more than that. But, today, those programmes were given an arm and a leg to get half that number or a third that number.
Well, I remember, This Week, that was Thames Television, wasn't it, or its forerunner? Yeah, and I remember, as a viewer and an avid viewer, there was, and you were a young reporter, very young then, when you did, I'm talking in terms of changing things, a report on a famine, another one, in Ethiopia. And 20 years before Live Aid, there was that cry of, oh my God, I didn't know this was going on.
There was one television report of a major famine in Africa, in Biafra, in I think 1967. Yeah. I heard about this situation in Ethiopia by all sorts of means that I'd never expected to. We went there, and there were no journalists there at all. There were no aid workers in the area. It was nothing, and it was the most hideous, seared on my mind and in my memory and in my heart the most hideous experience that one could ever hope to have. 200,000 what they call excess deaths. Children on pallets, their mothers weeping over them, skeletal bodies, and no help at all. And so we managed to get it out with some difficulty, because the authorities discovered that they'd said there was a drought. They had not said that there was a mass famine, and that there was typhoid, which is sort of red flag, which is very serious because it spreads so rapidly, and cholera as well, which was even more serious. So we smuggled it out effectively, and it went on air, and it was very, very powerful, because the images were so powerful and the evidence was so terrible. And in fact, it was shown on ITV. The BBC then re-showed it. That was the measure of how important it was. And it went on to raise very, very large sums of money. I think about 70 million within a few weeks. In today's money, 70 million, which was then used to rehabilitate. It also led to the overthrow of the government, or was used.
Haile Selassie.
By the government. And it was a very important, it was, I suppose, yes, you're careful about saying life-changing, but very much life-influencing, because I got very involved then in these issues of the environment, of human rights, agriculture, inequalities, and conflict. And when you look at the world today and you see this, I used to think when I was young, well, I've made this report. I made a number of other reports, and they seemed at the time to have weight and significance. I think, well, it's said something now will happen, surely. Something will change. But actually, you look at the world today, you look at what's happening in Ukraine, you look at what's happening in Sudan, you look at what's happening in Palestine and elsewhere, often not recorded. And we have a world situation. I find it quite difficult to be glass half full. Which has always been my nature. You look at a world situation which all these tensions are likely to be exacerbated, the movements of people, for instance, because of the overriding long-term impact of climate change, which we kind of want to shy away from. It actually is going to cause mass movements of people unless we solve it. Mass movements of people, mass hungers, mass economic crisis, and therefore intense and horrible conflict. It's a very downbeat thing to say, but I think it's really important.
I say, well, are you glass half empty or glass three quarters empty? I mean, has this career in seeing all that and seeing that it isn't changing? If anything, it's getting worse. I mean, you say you're not despairing, but are you heading that way?
I'm not. A lot of things have improved, of course. Massive changes in living standards generally, massive changes in education, massive changes in health, all for the better. And I've witnessed them in Africa, and I've witnessed them in Latin America, and I've witnessed them here in Europe. It's changed. It's hugely changed since I was a young reporter, and that's all beneficial. And we're much more understanding. Socially in this country, we have, generally speaking, a much greater understanding of all the issues that really matter for people: justice and fairness, our relations between the genders and the sexes. When I was young, homosexuality was illegal. Certainly, we came to gay relationships and accepting them and gay marriage very recently. These are massively forward-looking changes. And so therefore I'm not down on that. I'm just, our capacity, despite all the information that we have, to destroy ourselves remains there. And that's exacerbated by monstrous characters who get into power by populism or by the gun, and then use that to extend their power. Now, that has not got better, even though there are more democracies in the world. The problem is that democracy, it becomes clear, doesn't necessarily lead you to tolerance, justice, and fairness.
Tell me about the the career path at ITV. It started at the BBC, wouldn't let you back on after your newsreading attempt for a while. A long time with those ITV companies, muscular regional companies. You mentioned Thames, there was Granada, again you mentioned World in Action, Yorkshire Television, of course, even TVAM. But was that a deliberate choice too? I mean, your brother was mainly at the BBC. Did you deliberately go to ITV?
Well, I did, and it was partly because my brother, who's a bit older than I am, was already very well entrenched at BBC, but more particularly, and it wasn't just this, I'd been working for the BBC and I'd enjoyed it, in London a bit as well, was the precisely what you've touched on. It was much smaller. So the hierarchies were much flatter. So I could go and talk to the head of programs. I could go and talk to the controllers without any difficulty. And if you were a reporter, and the more, as you became prominent, you automatically did that. Or if you were presenting, programs and so forth. And the companies were small, and they were very competitive, incidentally, before it was all came together in an engaging way. For quite a long time, I worked for Yorkshire. I left Thames. I went back to Thames later, worked for Yorkshire. Paul Fox, who was a great man of that era, friend of my father's, it happens, admirer of my father's, he's a lot younger, was the controller of programmes there, having been controller at the BBC, head of BBC One, I think, controller of programmes anyway. And he was the boss in Yorkshire. And he understood how things worked. So he said, we had this amazing team. I was just a cog. I was a presenter of it. I helped produce some of the programs, but in that was principally the cog. And the program was brilliant documentaries, beautifully made by very, very skillful program makers who had the resource and the time to do them, some of which were unforgettable and had a huge impact. And he said, the only way I can be sure of getting my 12 programs on the air is to call the series First Tuesday. So he did. He got the slot first Tuesday of every month.
Genius.
So that's how it worked.
But as you say, I mean, it was obviously a smaller firmament, but those companies, yes, they were stripped down, more lean and mean, but they had bigger budgets, obviously, and were prepared to spend them on current affairs. It's hard to believe now. Our
budget for current affairs was tight. The documentary budget was much, much larger, but we were then shooting on film. So you couldn't just roll off reams of tape. You were on film, and each roll in those days cost £100. So you were allocated a ratio of 6-to-1. So it was a 30-minute program. So you had the tapes that were a 6-to-1 ratio for 30 minutes. And if you went over, it was a serious issue. Producers who went over were in big trouble. And so you used to... I'm afraid what you used to, in interviews, you will know this very well. Sometimes people take a long time to get to the point that you're after, either because they're wanting to escape the point or they're not quite sure what you're after. So we would have a system, or I did, and it's a very disreputable system. We would stand there and you were talking to someone who maybe certainly wasn't familiar with television, and you would talk to them, and you would say before you start, let's have the orange filter on. So you'd put quotes, the orange filter on, which meant that they weren't turning over this very expensive film. And then when you knew that they were kind of warmed up or close to the point where you wanted to do that a bit, you would say, okay, I think we can get, I didn't know what an orange filter was. Not sure there was one. Well, there was, I suppose. And I'd say, okay, let's have the other filter on, or something like that. And they would cut, and then you'd cut to the length. But it meant too that camera operators had to be incredibly careful with what they shot because they couldn't waste the footage. And so they used to think very well about what it would be like for the editor who was going to be putting this film all together back in the machinery, the Steinbeck it was called, back at base. It was all much slower in lots of ways too, because if you're in Africa, you had to book a call to London. I'm talking about the 70s and the early 80s, and quite often the line wasn't open, and you booked a call for the evening. You didn't have mobile phones, so when you were travelling around with a crew and you were in the middle of nowhere, you would have these detailed kind of steers about how to get there. Go down this road, that road. When you reach the telegraph pole, turn right, and then you might find a village. And we hope it's the right one. Yeah. You would do that, and you would often, and these were expensive days, you would often end up with people in different directions, and then you couldn't get in touch with one another. So it was always quite hair-raising. That was probably the most I was in some pretty horrible situations, but that was as hair-raising, practically speaking, as anything else.
We'll take a short break there. This podcast is brought to you by Big Motoring World, one of the UK's biggest used car supermarkets. Their mantra is we're big on what matters to you. And they're big on choice, service and value. They price check their cars every day to give a best price guarantee with up to 95% of cars priced below market value. Search bigmotoringworld.co.uk to find your nearest store and for terms and conditions. So, end of the 80s, you go back to the BBC. They do let you back. For the so-called, you were kind of at the heart of the so-called, I remember at the time, the Bertist revolution. John Birt, who you'd worked with at LWT, takes over at the BBC. You didn't work with him. He had been at LWT, yeah.
I was post-Birt. I greatly respected him, but I took him to task in the pages of the Times. He said, our mission is to explain. That was for a program called Weekend World, which was very successful and very good. And I wrote and said, actually, my mission is to explore because I want to understand. It's not my job to tell you how the world is and how it should be. My job is to say, this is what the world looks like from my perspective. This is what I've seen and this is what I want to say about it. And so I was rather again that. I got on perfectly well with him, still would, I'm sure. And as I say, I greatly respect him. He did some very, very good things. He was in front of the game technologically, for instance, took the BBC forward. But that sort of assertion of the right to explain, not something I've ever been a great fan of. I now spend most of my life seeking to explain, of course, because I've become too self-important.
No, absolutely not. Jonathan, I'm so heartened to hear that because being the genius that you are, you naturally anticipated my question there about John Birt and this mission to inform and all that. Because, at the time from the outside, I was just starting at ITV and it was, John Birt, he puts these programmes on the air and he has a preconceived notion of what the answers are. So you keep asking the questions until you get the answer that fits the category. And it's just so heartening to hear that you were not doing that. Yeah, I know, it's your trademark. You listen, you ask a question and you listen and you don't know what your second question is because you're waiting for the answer.
Well, you plan, if you're doing those long form interviews, which I did a lot of over between mid-80s and 2005 or so from BBC and for ITV, as it had then become. That was on LWT still, but it was a network show. And I was doing big, long interviews with politicians and so on. You then did prepare it quite carefully, and you sort of had a roadmap, and you would play the interview in advance. If he says this, what shall I say? But it wasn't, or, and someone would play the part of being the interviewee. Someone would be Mrs. Thatcher, or someone would be whoever it was. It was quite fun, that, actually, because it was sort of game playing, and you would ask the question, and they give an answer, and then I become I say he wouldn't have said that. He would have said this. So you have a to and fro. So it was much more open, but I did have notes that I used, but you could go away from the notes because sometimes people say something you don't expect. Surprise, surprise, and therefore you have to follow that. But more often than not, they do more or less say what you think is likely, and you need to know what you think they're going to say so that you can then test it. Because one of the things about the long-form interview, which I'm afraid has been severely eroded, the talent is there to do it in spades, but severely eroded as a form, is that you could challenge the assumption that was being made by the interviewee. You could challenge and challenge and challenge. You didn't have to shout or yell. You could do it very carefully, very clearly, and very precisely. But you could go at it and say, no, I don't. That wasn't my question, and doing it perfectly. But I have a great deal of sympathy with the mega talents there are on radio and television today who are, compressed by time. And then they get accused of interfering, interrupting, and so on. That's quite unfair.
Yeah, and do you think the politicians have changed as well?
God,
yes. They're way better media trained, and they think, well, if this person won't ask me the right questions, well, I'll just bypass them now. I'll go on TikTok or Instagram or whatever and address the voters directly.
I remember doing an interview once with he was the Secretary of State for Education, Conservative, right back in the 80s. It was for TVAM, and he was looking. It was Bruce Gingell, who was the controller, liked everything to be pink. I refused to be pink, but I didn't have pink tablecloths. It was a breakfast show, and I used to do the party conferences, and here was this poor man. He was very nice, and he came on. He was looking so anxious and so uncomfortable because it was his day for his speech. And I said, "What's you don't look, this is just for you don't look at all relaxed, mate." He said, "I don't know, because I've got to go into that conference hall and I've got to speak." I said, "Well, that's what you do. You're a politician. You've got an audience that will give you a standing ovation. It's no big deal, is it?" And he then said, "But you don't understand. They have these screens up with the words written on them. And when I was doing it, went faster and faster. And I couldn't keep up with them." He didn't realise that the autocue follows you. Yeah. He thought he had to follow the autocue, and he was really upset. So when I then reassured him, he totally relaxed.
A bit of impromptu media training.
That was a measure of the time, the sort of innocence. It was an illustration of the innocence of politicians. I mean, they were still very wily and knew what they wanted to say, and some of them were very brilliant. But I had a feeling that they were. You can delude yourself, but I think they were slightly more forthcoming. Less sounding like a speak your weight machine, because you can listen to so many interviews now and you know exactly, or I do, exactly what's going to be said repetitiously, and you use cost of living crisis again and again and again. On the other hand, the last 14 years, you hear that all the time, and I think viewers get incredibly, and listeners get very irritated by that repetition of mantra. They're too bright to be kind of bombarded with the same statements. I didn't think people are so thick that you had to say it 100 times for them to understand it. That's not my experience of the British public, anyway.
Tell me what qualities you identified as an interviewee in The King, the then Prince of Wales, Prince Charles. 1994, The Private Man, The Public Role. This was a landmark interview. And you talked about having the time. I mean, clearly it wasn't live, but you got the time. But you asked the questions, the hard questions.
I spent a long time with him, and I filmed with him all over the world, and the interviews were done as we went along. I came to have the huge, which I still have, huge respect for him, and a great deal of affection, as it happens. He was not, in those days, a natural interviewee. He was very sensitive, he didn't like shouting the odds. He wasn't that kind of character. He wasn't a politician. He was thoughtful. He was careful. He was, but had great passion. So he would deliver speeches which were filled with passion on the environment, for instance, on agriculture, on architecture. He would go into the inner cities. He was doing great things as a Prince of Wales at that time. But as an interviewee, he was uncomfortable. He became increasingly comfortable. But of course, nowadays, King, you don't do interviews. So he just performs, in my view. I remember, and I wrote a lot about this, to fess up, I know him now well. And I wrote a lot about the absurdity of saying, the monarchy will die with the Queen. What's going to happen? I knew perfectly well that he would fulfill that role completely perfectly, faultlessly, and also that he would be himself as well. So he uses his own words and brings his own humanity. He's a different era from his mother, and he will say things, and he will find ways of saying it without causing offence. And he's got credibility because he was first off the starting line on the environment way back in the 80s. When he speaks about that. He has a great deal of authority. And of course, because he's been around the world so much, he's been in a position of prominence for longer than any other human being. Traveled further, met more people, and he's got a lot of wisdom, and people listen to him.
Was that young man, that trainee monarch, if I can term it, that voice in the wilderness in a way about the environment you described from then? Is he still in there? Because as you say, well, he can't be as explicit as he was then. But is that person still there?
Very, very, very much so. He cares about it enormously. He's obviously very troubled by what is happening, the increase in global temperatures, and I have no doubt that he will in private, and also he convenes groups of people, which he has the right and authority to, in private, to debate and discuss and find ways through, and he is absolutely front and center of that. He has not changed an iota. He's just more of an expert now, perhaps, than he was once a long time ago.
And what effect do you think it had in that dynamic? And there was a ferment about it, wasn't there, at the time, the relationship between Diana and Charles. What effect do you think that interview had on her decision then, ill-fated, I guess, to talk to Martin Bashir?
You know what? I don't know. And it's not something I kind of really want or can usefully explore. I thought that Martin Bashir's behaviour, as it happens, I learned about like everyone else much later, was, how can I put it, less than admirable. You and I tiny little blip in the broadcasting firmament. You and I were colleagues. To my great joy, you probably didn't even notice, at ITN for a couple of general elections in 1997 and 2001. Of course, the Blair landslides. I remember every minute.
Yeah.
I remember every
you think of little else.
Of your contribution.
I could see my portrait behind you. But they're tremendous fun, aren't they? It was certainly the 97 one. The 2001 less so, because nothing really happened.
Yeah, I think I did three of them. I did the 2005 as well, 2004, and the 97 was extraordinary because it was this great sea change from a Conservative government, which actually a very underestimated Prime Minister, in my view, John Major, in an impossible position, lost, and Tony Blair, the New Labour, came in, and they were quite dramatic and exciting times, and the actual task of being a presenter on those occasions is a very enjoyable challenge, because you've got people talking to you all the time. You're saying, Jonathan, just 10 seconds now, can you just film? Then we're going to go to Greenwich. No, we're going to Southwark, or wherever it might be, and that is it's a thrilling challenge. And the interesting thing is, you're told the exit poll, one or two or three people only before the programme is on air. Then you announce the exit poll, and then you're underway, and you're hoping that the exit poll, and in fact, I was fortunate, very closely coincides with the actual result, and then you're on air and you're away. And you know what? I hope anyone watching or listening won't mind. Usually, from time to time, one wants to go to the loo. Between 10 o'clock at night and 8 o'clock in the morning when we came off air, I never got the need to. And I was drinking water and eating every so often when you were off camera. And the exhilaration and the adrenaline flow is quite extraordinary.
Secrets of the live news anchor. Another big interview of the 90s. Let's just touch on it, because again, it was a world-changing event. The handover of Hong Kong, your relationship with the last governor, as he was termed and was, Chris Patten.
Yeah, that was a 5-year project. I knew he was one of the very. I've never felt that it's improper to know politicians or to like politicians, or indeed to dislike politicians. I've never thought that politicians, on the whole, are venal people who are merely. There are those, certainly are those, and they're around today. But most of them serious, wanting to do good, and also with ambition and ego, of course, because you can't do much in politics without both those two characteristics. And I had grown to know Chris because he lived, I wasn't in the same constituency, he lived nearby, and our children were the same sort of age. And so when he lost his seat, I saw him actually in the very morning he lost his seat, in the early hours of the morning after he had lost in that 92 election. And he said, I don't know what to do. And he asked me what I thought, and he asked others. Anyway, he opted for Hong Kong. And he said, it means I won't see my friends. And I am afraid, being very journalistic as well as being very fond of him, I said, well, I've got a way through this. Why don't I come and make a series of programs about the last 5 years of British rule in Hong Kong? Nothing will be transmitted until it's over, but you have to speak to me freely and everyone else around, and I'll do what I can with everyone else. And so that's what happened. So I went back and forth, as well as doing a weekly program on radio and a weekly program on television, and going to, I don't know how I did it now, and also writing another book. I mean, it's crazy, over too much. And I'm sure it made the quality much lower than it might otherwise have been. But it was exhilarating times. And I used to finish a program on Sunday, and then I would get on the plane, go to Hong Kong, film Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, get back in time because of the time change to do any questions on Radio 4 on Friday, and then my Sunday program. And then I didn't go to Hong Kong every week, mind, but quite a lot. And it was very interesting to do. And of course, the poor journalists who were based in Hong Kong and who knew that I had this access loathed me. I would have loathed me if I'd been them as well. But
them's the breaks.
And it was a big thing. It was in that handover. I mean, this was 5 years of film. We made 5 programs. In those days, it was on BBC One, and it was 5 hours of television about a political process in Hong Kong. Now, you wouldn't get that today.
Another one worth revisiting. And your assessment of that, having been there on the spot, we now see how the one country, two systems has developed. I mean, was it a mistake, or, from the UK point of view, or in the world of realpolitik, there was no choice. This is China, really. He inherited a role. The role was, and his job was to try and expand as much as he could the envelope of democracy, not helped by the British Foreign Office, who were kowtowing to China. But it didn't make any difference what happened. China was going to do. I thought that China might behave better, and earlier people in positions of power in China might have done so, but the current regime wasn't prepared to do so. So I have got now friends who are Hong Kong figures who are in jail on trumped up charges, which they keep renewing, just like Putin does with his enemies. No reason to do it apart from the fact he doesn't like them. And in Hong Kong, it's absolutely horrible what is happening, and it's a grotesque situation where a relatively free area with all sorts of promise has been turned into a sort of awful vassal state of the homeland, of the mainland, and that's very, very depressing. Well, you mentioned Putin and vassal states and techniques going there. We started this chat with your perspective, given your insights gained through journalistic endeavour on the Palestinians. Let's end it with, because I know of your recent histories on Russia, the former Soviet Union. You've written about Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the USSR. You've written about Stalin's then role in the Second World War. And of course, that gives us a lot of explanation about what's happening now with Putin and with Russia, with, their attitude, the Russian attitude to the entire rest of the world, and their rightful place as they see it at the heart of Asia and Europe.
Putin, like lots of leaders, incidentally, but Putin specifically, as they say, weaponizes history to justify the invasion of Ukraine, which is totally unjustifiable. There were valid grounds, in my view, for the Russians after the fall of the Soviet Union back in 1991, for saying, please don't extend NATO eastwards. And they had really open conversations with the Americans, who gave verbal undertakings. They had no plans to go beyond what was then East Germany. And they did so. And so it was both, there was a genuine fear, popular fear, easy to exploit in Russia, of the surrounding enemy, and a genuine sense, which I think might well have been shared in Europe had it been the other way round, that this was a threat, but it could be weaponized by Putin. They're surrounding us, they're an enemy, and also Ukraine belongs to us. There's a long, tortured history of Ukraine, but there are no grounds for saying it belonged. What they're done, what you pray for, is a is the only way out. Became to rather belatedly realised, I think, that there has to be, I'm afraid, to get some kind of peace. You cannot expect the feet on the ground to just remove themselves. Crimea will not be surrendered. No chance it'll be surrendered, in my view. It's too deep in the history. It's embedded in Russia's imperial history, and it's embedded in the mindset now of those in Russia who think that they can command the world. They won't leave. I mean, we'll all be blown up before they leave.
Jonathan, we are privileged to get your insight, your perspective, your analysis based on this long and continuing career in journalism. Thank you so much for appearing on the podcast. And I know you've got to go, so get back to what's really important in life. I know you've got to go and post a present to your grandchild. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
My pleasure. Nice to be with you.